The shared Baltic art histories of the late Soviet era tends to be a little discussed topic, as this is the time when Soviet art apparatus is slowly losing its grip in the western periphery of the Soviet Union, and national awakenings gain new momentum in the free Baltic countries. However, the artists who worked in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania during the late Soviet decades were still inevitably united by the almost identical Soviet environments that surrounded them at the time. Even though they had long lost their meaning here, the Soviet slogans and propaganda images still covered the public spaces of Vilnius, Riga, as well as Tallinn, and workplaces still had red corners with lavish Soviet decorations. So in my short presentation, I will try to argue that in the 1970s, a new urban culture emerged in the Baltics that was about taking back the cityscapes that Soviet regime had claimed in the 1940s. And this new urban culture encouraged Baltic artists to also turn to a new radical appropriation art that recycled the Soviet visual culture that covered these public spaces in Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn. So this new urban culture beared very similar traces in the free Baltic republics. Namely, it was first of all about the younger generation of artists who started simply strolling around their cities, exploiting different parts of the city, and of course taking photos during these city strolls. So in Vilnius, Mindaugas Navakas used this material later in his studio to imagine, with the help of miniature sculptural models that he created and photomontage, the gigantic sculptures invading different parts of the city of Vilnius. Whereas in Riga, pollutionists turned Riga into a bizarre or surreal city, basically refusing the grey, rationally organized, modernist public space that the Soviet regime had created. And in Tallinn, Jüri Okas was analyzing the Soviet layers of the city, looking at it as an ambivalent space that could at the same time be integrating or disintegrating. And I really liked how Andres Kurg recently called his reconstruction series the revolving door between chaos and order. So what makes this new Baltic urban culture remarkable is the way that it claimed back the cityscapes in the western periphery of the Soviet Union, whereas in the center of the Soviet state, nothing similar could emerge in the 1970s. So in Moscow, as we all well know, the bulldozer exhibition in the outskirts of Moscow in 1974, where a peaceful outdoor exhibition was smashed by the tractors and bulldozers, clearly demonstrated that the authorities did not accept any spontaneous cultural activity in the public space. And this message to the unofficial artists that they could not get out of their apartments yet for another decade, resulted in the emigration of the almost full generation of younger unofficial artists. And due to the New York Times coverage and international pressure, the Soviet government eventually did grant permission for another outdoor exhibition in Izmailovsky Park. But this was clearly a performance that was staged for the Western media, and it didn't really change the state of things. The fact that the public space in Moscow stayed under strict control in the 70s as well as much of the 80s. And for a lot of younger artists, this, of course, meant that they could not really continue with their work in Moscow, and especially the Sotsart generation, for whom the appropriation of Soviet visual culture from the public spaces stood in the center of their artistic practices. So, as I already mentioned, in the Baltics, this new urban culture that claimed back cities that had been colonized by the Soviet regime also brought along a new wave of appropriation culture. In post-colonial research, as we know, the concept of appropriation is used most often to describe the ways in which post-colonial societies take over those aspects of imperial culture, like the language, forms of writing, film, theater, even modes of thought and argument, such as rationalism, logic, and analysis, that may be useful to them in articulating their own social and cultural identities. Whereas in the context of modern and contemporary art, appropriation most often refers to the use of existing objects or images with minimal modification, and in specific art definitions, such practices are associated with the critique of key concepts such as originality and authenticity. So the development of a new appropriation art in the western periphery of the Soviet Union was apparently related to the fact that in the Baltics, both of these definitions of appropriation were relevant in the late Soviet era. And here you can see an early collage from Andres Stolz, an Estonian artist who has appropriated here a reproduction of a famous socialist realist painting by Vladimir Rudstein. And why I find this early work by Stolz so important is exactly the way that it embodies the border culture that the Baltics inevitably was during the late Soviet decades, whereas the appropriation here is done in the almost American neo-Dada spirit, namely the artist uses ready-made extensively here. The appropriated reproduction clearly speaks about the Soviet art system, where endless circulation of chosen visual tropes via reproduction technologies was more important than the concept of originality. So, what we are clearly witnessing here is a hybrid border culture of the Baltic art. And this is what I claim. I claim that during the late Soviet decades, the Baltics developed a more radical appropriation art than that of Moscow, where appropriation was still realized mainly in the medium of painting, not so much in ready-made as it was in the Baltics. And I have to admit that in the Baltics, the Latvians actually became the most radical in their appropriation art. For example, here we see the work by Latvian conceptual artist Leonard Lapin, called Biography, First Department from 1990. And in this work, Laganovsky's, as a true Soviet conceptualist, appropriates the bilingual door signs of Soviet Latvian institutions, from a hospital to a pioneer camp, the art academy, a military unit, and housing and maintenance administration. So basically bringing together the whole life cycle of a Soviet citizen. But upon closer examination, these Latvian and Russian language signs in different colors are united by a phrase at the end of each that states the first department. And as we know, in the Soviet Union, the first department was always the KGB department, regardless of the nature of the institution. It is quite remarkable that during the transition period, Leonard Laganovsky commissioned these signs from the same workshops that had made the official signs for Soviet Latvia for many, many decades. And this is this kind of appropriation of the whole functioning of a Soviet institution is what makes this appropriation art really remarkable and radical to my mind. Leonard Laganovsky, even though he belonged to a different generation who had already access to new information due to his stay in Berlin at the end of 1980s, was still walking parallel paths with Estonian artist Andres Tolts in many ways. Namely, Laganovsky and Tolts were both highly interested and intrigued by the Soviet environment around them, as though they knew that soon this material would become totally obsolete. It would become a strange anachronism that would be thrown into the dustbin of history. Tolts, by the way, would call this material the environmental material, keskkonnamaterjal, and look for the most banal but also for the most bizarre elements of the Soviet mass production for his own work. And already at the end of 1960s, he would become obsessed with the Soviet floral chintz that he would later use in many of his textile assemblages. But here you can see a late textile assemblage by Tolts called Constantinople. It was made in 1990, where he has also used or appropriated the banal plastic trays that were used in the Soviet canteens. So Tolts is clearly playing a fine game here between the high and low culture. Laganovsky's, on the other hand, became interested in the Soviet decorative styles that were used in interior design when wallpaper was too expensive to afford and patterns were instead applied with a special painting roll. And he used these decorative styles most extensively in his series called Scientific Organization of Work that you see on the left here. Also a work from 1990 that now belongs to the Latvian National Art Museum. So what I really want to stress here is that similarly, like Tolts, Laganovskis seem to enjoy the strange self-sufficient world of Soviet environments, industrial design and industrial production, and exploit it almost in the spirit of camp described by Susan Sontag in her writings. But I also really loved the way that Hungarian art historian Edith Andras lately reacted to my own presentation about Andras Tolts, saying that clearly what Tolts is doing here in his textile assemblages, he's queering the masculine Soviet space, queering or, emasculating even. But this is the reason why I think that it's really important to see the Soviet environment or environmental material, as Andras Tolts would call it, as an inspiration behind these works of appropriation by Tolts and Laganovskis. But since this seminar is about similarity as well as difference, then what makes Laganovskis still very different from Tolts is that he is driven by a conceptualist mindset where he sees as the task of the artist to first of all make meaningful gestures rather than engage with fine handicraft or solve sophisticated design problems of how to arrange a visual field, which was, I think, the central problem or concern for Tolts, who was educated as a designer. To my mind, there is also a special division in Soviet conceptualism that aspired to describe the ways that Soviet power wished to permeate all areas of Soviet life. And in our Thinking Pictures exhibition at Kumu, we have called these kind of works fundamental lexicons, as some of you saw yesterday. So these fundamental lexicons, they try to imitate the dream of the totalitarian regime to create structuralist systems that would permeate all areas of Soviet life. And this is also one of the reasons why I think that serial thinking became so important in Soviet conceptualism, as it actually made it possible to create more complex and voluminous information systems than the individual auratic paintings would allow. And of course, one of such examples of fundamental lexicons is Leonard Laganovskis' work, Vision Test Chart by Laganovskis from 1988, where the artist is creating a semiotic or sign system out of the Soviet bureaucratic language, the notorious acronyms such as KGB. And in this ambition to describe the ways of the totalitarian power to permeate all areas of life, Laganovskis is actually closer to another Estonian artist who has been mentioned today already several times. And of course, I mean what we have here is a funny mirror image of or symmetry to Leonard's conceptualists, one defining the early Soviet era conceptualism in Latvia, and the other doing the same in Estonia. And by the way, for Leonard Lapin, one of the decisive moments in his artistic career was actually spending time in Soviet army in Riga, where he and many of his companions learned to speak perfect Russian, but not only. The Soviet army, as Lapin has recalled, they had this culture there among the small Soviet nations to use Russian language with heavy foreign accent, and I think from there we really have to find kind of the starting point of the post-colonial appropriation that Lapin is later using a lot in his works. And here you can see his painting series called Signs from 1977 to 1980. Part of this series now belongs to the Zimmerli Art Museum in New Jersey, and part to Art Museum of Estonia. But basically, what Lapin is doing here is very close to what Laganovskis was doing in his work, which is kind of creating this Soviet alphabet. And what also unites Laganovskis and Lapin is the way that their conceptual art later joins the postmodernist currents of the late 80s and early 90s, which of course were also there in the Soviet Union, because here one great narrative of Soviet modernity was becoming to an end. So it's natural that Soviet Union did have its own specific postmodernism. But this is the time when Lapin is creating his graphic series, Conversation of Signs. So again, dealing with sign systems, where he organizes clashes between opposing doctrines or isms, such as abstractionism and Stalinism, or suprematism and socialism. And these kind of semiotic clashes were actually very typical for late Sots art. The Sots art that was created by the Russian Jewish emigre artists already in New York at the end of 1980s and in the 1990s, where they would usually organize clashes between socialist and capitalist signs, such as the famous Lenin and Giacometti by Leonid Sokov. But yeah, this is really among the last slides. So similar kind of semiotic clashes we can see here in Leonard's Laganovskis' work that is called I Shop at Lenin's, I Shop at Engels, from the series To Your Health. Having the privilege to travel a lot at the end of the 80s, because Laganovskis could spend longer time in Berlin, kind of gave him a privilege also, I think, among the Latvian artists, and that might be the reason why Laganovskis really stands out from the context of Latvian art of the time with his witty conceptualism and bold appropriation art. I will just briefly show you the the exhibition view from Kumu, Kumu's Thinking Pictures exhibition. And here, as you can see, the exhibition is now waiting for the dialogue between Lapin and Laganovskis to take place. And I think that the fact that this exhibition in Kumu is now still half empty is actually a good illustration to the fact that the shared Baltic art histories also still need to be written, and I'm sure they will be written, as Karin Vicente also beautifully said in the morning in her comment, that they are now needed more than ever before. Thank you.